I want to talk about whether or not we're headed for a recession. And I did some research to see what the left, the right, and the center thinks. So Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan both considered neutral sources because their economic forecasts rely on financial models, historical trends, and market data rather than political ideology estimate a higher probability of recession. Goldman Sachs projects a 45% chance, citing risks such as trade restrictions and inflationary pressure, while JP Morgan has raised its estimate to 60%, pointing to aggressive trade policies, global financial instability as potential triggers. These institutions focus on GDP growth, inflation rates, consumer spending, and labor market conditions to assess economic risk, providing insights for investors without advocating specific political positions. In my view, having a finance and accounting background and finance, accounting, and tax background, I feel like however you feel about these large investment companies, I feel like they are more centered and neutral than maybe a different kinds of political slants that we might hear, or even news broadcasters. Because let's face it, it's hard not to have your own personal biases, even in a news broadcast, especially today, because journalism isn't what it used to be. Okay, so the National Bureau of Economic Research, another neutral source, defines a recession as 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. The U.S. recorded its first quarter of decline since 2022, meaning another contraction would officially confirm a recession. So there's that. The Federal Reserve is also considered neutral because it relies on data analysis rather than political advocacy. Expects slower economic growth, but notes that the labor market remains resilient, which could prevent a full-scale downturn. So far we've looked at what's considered neutral sources, and it's not looking totally great at this point. Now let's look at some right or left-leaning sources. Forbes, which is considered a more right-leaning source, reports that Wall Street analysts are divided. UBS Wealth Management, a neutral institution, predicts that the U.S. will avoid a recession if trade deals and supply chain issues stabilize. So what that means is if things continue on the path that it's on, we may not avoid a recession, right? So that's not necessarily good news. Where was I? However, Investor Hub and the Heritage Foundation, both right-leaning sources, warn that tariffs, inflation, and rising interest rates could trigger an economic slowdown. So those are right-leaning, and they are saying, hey, something bad may be coming. So let's see. Right-leaning analysts often emphasize tax policy and government intervention as primary economic risks. That's true. Here's some news sources on it. Like I said, I don't know if I consider them reliable sources on the economy. USA Today and US News, both considered left-leaning because their economic analysis often focus on labor conditions, trade disputes, and government spending, report high recession risks due to declining consumer confidence, government layoffs, and trade instability. These sources highlight worker protections and public sector stability as key indicators of economic health. I don't disagree with this. I mean, I've reported on here about the government layoffs and some of these other things that I think could signal that a recession is imminent. So that's not the right word. It's a recession is possible is probably more accurate in my view. So here's what I say. The mixed predictions reflects the complexity of forecasting economic downturns. Left-leaning sources emphasize trade disruptions and labor market risks, while the right-leaning sources focus on government policy and regulatory burdens. Neutral institutions rely on historical recession patterns and data-driven models for evaluating potential risks. So the likelihood of a recession will depend on key economic indicators such as GDP, inflation, labor trends, and consumer spending. So what that means is we need to monitor all of those factors in the coming months to see whether or not a recession is coming. Because, if a recession is coming, we want to prepare. I think that the president has a lot of control over whether or not a recession is imminent. And hopefully he will take steps that will prevent that in the future. But right now, I feel like we are heading in that direction. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. I'll see you next time.